defense around the Crimean Bridge is facing one of its most complex stress tests so far. Pressure is now building from several directions at once, and the protection network appears increasingly strained. Warning systems are active, but the core issue is that the threat is not coming in the most expected way. The bridge itself is not always the direct target. Instead, the supporting infrastructure that keeps it operating is being hit. During the night, Russian energy infrastructure linked to Crimea came under renewed pressure. The Krymskaya oil pumping station in Krasnodar Krai was reportedly struck, while inside Crimea, the Gvardiskaya fuel storage facility was also targeted. On the map, these sites may seem separate, but operationally, they are tied into the same logistical chain. One supports supply on the Russian mainland side, the other reinforces the Crimean side. That means both ends of the bridge's support network are now under simultaneous strain. This matters because bridge defenses are designed first and foremost to stop direct attacks on the structure itself. When strikes focus on nearby support nodes instead, the response system becomes less efficient. Radar and air defense assets remain concentrated around the bridge, while incoming threats exploit less protected gaps around it. The result is a defense posture that looks active, but struggles to fully contain the disruption. Distance also plays an important role. The Krymskaya facility sits roughly 100 to 120 kilometers from the bridge. That may sound significant, but in practice, it places the site within the broader logistical shield surrounding the crossing. It also supports Crimea and the Novorossiysk direction, meaning its function still feeds into the bridge's strategic value. Gvardiskaya, by contrast, lies much closer to the Crimean exit corridor. Taken together, these strikes suggest deliberate pressure on the most important supply routes, rather than random harassment. Russia claims dozens of drones were intercepted, but the broader issue is not simply how many were shot down. The larger question is whether the defensive system can still protect the wider logistical network under sustained pressure. This escalation also follows earlier disruption in the Kerch Strait. Just 2 days before, the heavy cargo ferry Slavyanin was reportedly disabled. That vessel was especially important because it could transport railcars, making it a key backup route for heavy logistics. Once that option was reduced, more supply weight shifted back toward the bridge and the land corridor. In that context, attacks on fuel and support sites near both ends of the bridge become far more significant. When one supply artery is already under pressure and additional strain is added at multiple support points, the entire system becomes more vulnerable to slowdown or disruption. That appears to be the broader aim: compress Russian logistics into fewer channels, and then pressure those channels until flexibility is lost. There are also claims that some strikes were supported by internal reconnaissance and sabotage. Reports suggest Ukrainian-linked groups may have helped identify targets or relay coordinates from inside occupied territory. At the same time, strikes expanded beyond Crimea and into rear areas closer to the front line. This broader wave was not focused on a single target. Instead, it appears designed to disrupt multiple battlefield functions at once. Rear ammunition depots near Makedonivka in Donetsk Oblast and along the Osipenko sector in Zaporizhzhia Oblast were among the reported targets. These locations are not just storage points. They serve as intermediate hubs that help maintain daily artillery tempo. A strike on such facilities does more than destroy stockpiles. It can slow resupply cycles, force frontline units to conserve ammunition, and reduce fire flexibility within hours. Modern artillery warfare depends heavily on fast rear-to-front logistics. Once that chain is disrupted, battlefield response becomes slower and less coordinated. Another major part of the operation reportedly focused on Russian drone command nodes in the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson sectors. These positions may appear minor from above, but in practice, they function as battlefield coordination centers. They connect surveillance, artillery, and frontline units into a shared operational picture. If these nodes are hit, situational awareness drops. Artillery becomes slower to react, reinforcements receive delayed updates, and gaps in the line become harder to manage. That is why strikes on such positions can have outsized effects even without large visible destruction. Fuel infrastructure in Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia was also reportedly targeted, adding further strain. The overall pattern suggests an effort to force Russian forces into constant reactive mode. While one damaged site is being repaired, another comes under attack elsewhere. According to some claims, Ukrainian resistance elements such as Atesh may have contributed by identifying vulnerabilities on the ground, while long-range drone units exploited openings in the wider defense network. The result was a coordinated pressure campaign stretching from Crimea to rear areas behind the front line. Meanwhile, another important development took place in the east. After 41 months of fighting, Siversk has reportedly fallen. But the significance of this event goes beyond the headline itself. Russia did not take Siversk through a rapid breakthrough. Instead, the battle became a prolonged attritional effort that lasted more than 3.5 years. During that period, large amounts of manpower, ammunition, and specialized units were committed to the Axis. Yet, the territorial gain remained relatively limited, roughly 12 kilometers in total. That is why the more meaningful question is not simply whether Siversk fell, but what the cost of taking it was. Before the war, Siversk had a population of fewer than 11,000. On paper, it may look like a small settlement, but in military terms, it was part of a wider defensive belt in Donbass. Positioned west of Lysychansk, it helped anchor nearby lines and created a defensive buffer across the sector. For Russia, the city was important because it offered a route toward the larger Kramatorsk-Sloviansk defensive zone. In that sense, Siversk was less important for its size than for its role as an operational stepping stone toward deeper objectives. Since mid-2022, this sector had been under relentless pressure. Russia did not attempt a rapid armored breakthrough here because the terrain simply did not allow it. Instead, it relied on a prolonged attritional approach: sustained artillery fire, probing infantry assaults, reconnaissance pressure, and continuous attempts to wear down the defense. The battlefield itself was difficult. Broken defensive pockets, ruined urban terrain, layered fallback positions, and limited maneuver space. It was never a place where quick gains were realistic. Ukraine understood that and turned the city into a long-term buffer zone. This was not a defense measured in weeks or months, but in years. Every damaged building, collapsed street, basement shelter, and improvised position became part of a larger effort to slow Russian momentum. Siversk was not simply held. It was used as a brake on Russia's operational tempo, forcing Moscow to keep spending resources for marginal gains. That helps explain why Russia concentrated such a large force here. Estimates suggest roughly 80,000 personnel were tied to this axis at various stages. More importantly, these were not only regular infantry units. Airborne troops, specialized assault formations, and Akhmat elements were also committed. This indicates that Russia treated the sector as strategically important. Yet after 41 months of pressure, the total advance was only around 12 kilometers. That pace is extremely slow by any operational standard. Spread across more than 3 years, it amounts to only limited monthly progress despite significant manpower and ammunition expenditure. On paper, a captured city may look like momentum. In practice, the cost tells a more complicated story. The key point is that Ukraine appears to have held the line until the city was no longer defensible in practical terms. By the time the withdrawal occurred, little usable urban structure remained. Years of artillery strikes, air attacks, and close combat had gradually destroyed the physical conditions required for sustainable urban defense. This matters because urban warfare depends on far more than troop presence. Effective city defense requires intact structures for cover, layered depth, usable firing positions, observation angles, and fallback routes. Once those conditions disappear, the tactical value of holding ground drops sharply. In that sense, Ukraine's withdrawal looks less like a collapse and more like a controlled decision to preserve remaining combat power. That interpretation is reinforced by comments from Ukrainian commander Serhiy Surchenko. He confirmed that he had been removed from his post, but his statement stood out for another reason. He openly acknowledged mistakes. He said he had spent nearly 500 days with his forces in the field rather than operating from behind a desk. He also admitted that there were moments when he pushed too hard, made errors, and stayed silent when he should have spoken. In a war where commanders rarely speak this candidly, that kind of statement is significant. It reflects how difficult and costly the Siversk line had become over time. The psychological aspect also matters. Every city lost on the front carries symbolic weight. But losing a city is not necessarily the same as losing the wider defensive line. That distinction is important here. Siversk was a key point, but it was not the final defensive threshold. For Russia, taking Siversk appears to have been only one step in a broader operational design. Yet even as attention focused on the front line, Ukraine was also testing Russian vulnerabilities far beyond the immediate battle zone. This time, the reported target was not a frontline depot or border installation, but offshore infrastructure deep inside the Caspian region. 2 northern Caspian Sea platforms were reportedly struck at a distance of roughly 1,000 kilometers from the front. That distance alone makes the incident strategically notable. These were not ordinary industrial facilities. Offshore platforms in this region are fixed energy assets designed for stable long-term production, even under difficult environmental conditions. They are part of a broader upstream supply chain that supports Russian fuel and export capacity. Unlike frontline infrastructure, such facilities were widely viewed as secure and geographically insulated. That perception became more important in recent months as Russia's western energy export routes came under repeated strain. Key Baltic terminals, such as Primorsk Oil Terminal and Ust-Luga Port, have faced repeated pressure. These hubs handle a significant share of Russia's seaborne oil exports, so even temporary disruptions can create ripple effects across storage, routing, and delivery systems. That is why the Caspian likely became more important. It is farther from NATO surveillance patterns, has more controlled maritime traffic, lies deeper inland, and has traditionally been seen as a lower risk zone. In other words, it was considered one of Russia's safer energy spaces. That is what makes this strike so consequential. The real effect may be less about immediate physical damage, and more about undermining assumptions of distance and safety. Offshore platforms are complex fixed systems with sensors, communications links, maintenance chains, and maritime access patterns. Reaching them requires more than just long-range capability. A successful strike at that depth would likely require detailed intelligence. Coordinates, patrol timing, radar coverage gaps, weather windows, and route planning. At distances like 1,000 kilometers, the greatest challenge is often avoiding early detection rather than simply covering the range. That suggests a high level of preparation rather than an improvised attack. As a result, even infrastructure once seen as secure may now require reassessment, repairs, and additional protection measures. At the same time, pressure reportedly continued on the Zaporizhzhia axis. Ukrainian forces are said to have carried out a coordinated strike on a Russian S-300V air defense system, a Palantin electronic warfare complex electronic warfare asset, and a UAV command post. This is important because layered battlefield protection depends on both electronic warfare and air defense working together. The Palantin system had reportedly been used to disrupt Ukrainian reconnaissance and strike coordination. If that layer was degraded first, it could create openings in the wider defensive network. The S-300V is also a high-value asset designed to protect critical military infrastructure and large force concentrations from aircraft and some missile threats. If both systems were weakened in sequence, Ukraine would gain more operational freedom for drones and precision strikes in that sector. The full impact on the front will become clearer over time. In many wars, the biggest shifts do not happen through one dramatic event, but through the accumulation of smaller disruptions that gradually widen existing cracks. If you find this kind of detailed breakdown useful, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel.